Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jordana Mendelson. I'm director of the King Juan Carlos Center, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of myself, Laura Torregano, our amazing associate director, without whom this event would have been much harder to put together, and all of our other staff and students who behind the scenes have worked so hard to work with us on this event, which has been many, many months in the making. Actually, it started as a pandemic era idea, and we're so glad that we could bring it forward in person. I want to explain a little bit of the context for the event and thank a few people and departments before I hand the program over to our introducer and moderator for the event, which is Laura Torres-Rodríguez. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her in a moment. So this panel is one of two panels that we've organized in celebration of our 25th anniversary of the center this year. And they were both meant to happen last spring online. And as I mentioned, this one we have the pleasure of being in person. So it's had its own kind of journey. The first panel was called Food and the Global Hispanophone, which took place last February, and you can view online. We recorded it, and it also came out in print as a conversation in Gastronomica, thanks to Melissa Fuster, who is part of that panel and is on the board of Gastronomica. I want to thank the graduate students of PASO, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Graduate Student Group, as well as the Global Philippine Studies Forum Graduate Student Group, because when we wanted to do a panel around the theme of decolonizing global geographies, we brought our grad students together and asked them, who would you like to come? Who would you like to be here? And all of the people you see listed here were among that group, along with several others who were at one point part of the conversation, and then because of the pandemic and family and different kinds of things, ultimately weren't able to join us tonight. But I really am grateful to our graduate students who brought their expertise and interest to our conversations. I also want to thank the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, who is a lifelong partner of ours in our programming, as well as the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and SULO, the Philippine Studies Initiative at NYU. When Laura and I thought about the kind of events that we wanted to put together for the anniversary, of which there are many, and you can consult them on the website, we thought about kind of two academic panels that might allow us to kind of question and think about and explore the role of Spain in the world. One was through food, which is something that in our center we really love and enjoy very much, our food and wine, and it was a very rich conversation about matter and discourse and food culture. And we also wanted to think in tonight's panel about geographies and how, when we think about Spain, we also have to push our understanding to think differently geographically, linguistically, and culturally. And so while Spain is not named here, it is in many ways a point of inflection, tension, and dialogue with the kind of conversations we'll have tonight. So I would just like to now introduce our moderator, Laura Torres-Rodríguez, who I have the pleasure of being in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese with. We were also co-PIs on a humanities lab called Cross Currents that we did with Luis Francia in SCA, which was really a way for me to learn even more about Laura's expertise. She is the author of Orientaciones Transpacíficas, La Modernidad Mexicana y el Espectro de Asia de 2020, which is a spectacular book. So in addition to being a moderator, she herself could also be a panelist on the table. So we're really leaning on her expertise tonight. She is going to help me introduce the rest of the panelists and explain a little bit of the format for this evening. So please help me welcome her and our other panelists.
So thank you, Jordana and Laura, for organizing the event and for the introduction. That was very generous. So it is an honor to welcome everyone to tonight's program. Before I introduce our panelists for the evening, I want to start by acknowledging that we speak from Lenape land and to recognize the importance of this land for Lenape people, past and present, and to emphasize the need to prioritize decolonial scholarship and practices. I am thrilled to present three scholars that I deeply admire, whose work has been opening paths for new generations of scholars. Their work pushes against the traditional boundaries of the field of Latin America, Caribbean, Peninsula, or Latinx studies precisely because it centers Black, Asian, and indigenous experiences and subjectivities in Luso and Hispanophone globalized contexts. Something that for me is very inspiring about their books, and I'm going to mention their books later, is that they invite us to think about how we can imagine and map relations, intimacies, or communities of feeling and resistance across all these geographies without replicating or reinscribing the violent legacies of Iberian imperialism, but also of mestizaje. This work is very hard, no? Especially in our institutional contexts, but it's equally pressing, no? So their work offers us conceptual and pedagogical imaginaries to think creatively about decolonization as the only possible future of our fields. So I will now like to introduce our speakers for the evening. And I'm going to introduce them all first, and then they're going to do the presentations, and then we're going to come back to the table. Yomaira Figueroa-Vásquez is an Afro-Puerto Rican writer, teacher, and scholar from Hoboken, New Jersey. She earned her MA and Ph.D. in Comparative Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and her BA in English, Puerto Rican, and Hispanic Caribbean Studies, and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She is Associate Professor of Afro-Diaspora Studies at Michigan State University and the author of the award-winning book, Decolonizing Diaspora, Radical Mapping of Afro-Atlantic Literature, Northwestern 2020. Her forthcoming book, The Survival of a People, examines the disappearances and excess of Afro-Puerto Rican island and diasporic peoples through the study of archival histories, photography, visual work, and film from the 19th century to the present. I'm so excited. Her presentation for today is titled Intimacies to Apocalypso, Afro-Atlantic Studies in Relation. So welcome, Yomaira. I'm not going to introduce Paula now. Our second speaker for tonight is Paula Park. Is an associate professor of Spanish and the chair of the Latin American Studies program at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. Her research and teaching interests are modern Latin American literature and culture, Philippine literature in Spanish and English, and U.S. Latinx studies. Park's book, Intercolonial Intimacies, Relinking Latino American to the Philippines, University of Pittsburgh Press, 2022, re-examines the geographically bound and ideologically charged definitions of Latinidad and Hispanidad by analyzing the work of 20th century Filipino and Latin American writers, cultural critics, and diplomats. Her current research project centers on Latin American Caribbean literature about Rapa Nui, Eastern Island from the middle of the 19th century to the present. Her presentation is titled Centering the Pacific in Hispanic and Latin American Studies. And our third panelist is Ana Paulina Lee. She is an associate professor of Latin American and Iberian cultures at Columbia University. She's the author of Mandarin Brazil, Race Representation and Memory, Stanford University Press, 2018. Winner of the 2019 Antonio Candido Prize for Best Book in the Humanities, awarded by the Brazil selection of the Latin American Studies Association. Mandarin Brazil examines the way that Brazilian cultural institutions and ideas about China and the Chinese ideas about China and the Chinese to strengthen nationalism and racial whitening ideologies. The book examines the cultural histories of Brazil and China through bringing together a multi-genre archive that maps the circulation of trade, labor, and material culture to reveal the connected histories of Chinese and Portuguese expansion and globalization to the hemispheric Americas. Her presentation for tonight is titled Extraterritorial Topics in Luso-Hispanic Asia. So I ask all of you to give our panelists a lot of welcome energy, and maybe an applause.
Hi, everybody. How y'all doing? Good. I'm so happy to be with you all today. I have not given a public talk about my work in a while. I had a baby, and so this is my first post-baby like talk, and my first talk in person in a really long time. So please bear with me, because voy a estar like estoy en otro mundo, but I'm here with you also. Yeah, thank you. um, my mind is like all over the place. Okay, but I'm so excited to talk today about the book project, my first book, Decolonizing Diasporas, Radical Mappings of Afro-Atlantic Literature, and to talk a little bit about Intimacies to Apocalypso. And the reason why it's titled Intimacies to Apocalypso is because Intimacies is the first chapter of the book. I open with thinking about intimacies. And the intimacies of colonial blackness, right, and the intimacies of coloniality. And I end with a meditation on Apocalypso, building on the work of Jamaican writer Michelle Cliff in her book, In My Heart, or in her essay, In My Heart of Darkness, where she talks about the limits of the white imagination. And when you hit that limit, the kind of apocalypso allows us to imagine other worlds, right, or places they can't imagine you in. But all of that to say, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. And the book is Decolonizing Diasporas. And in the book, I trace the long histories of connection between the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, so Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, and Guinea Equatorial, the only Spanish-speaking nation state in sub-Saharan Africa, and their literatures and culture productions written in exile and diaspora. And so this is kind of it's really funny because it's like a Google map that I screenshot, and then a few things like that is uh hmm? No. No, dime. Oh, Anabon. Yeah, that is Anabon. We have an expert of Equatorial Guinea here. Benita San Pedro, yes. Abu, we have some Santeros, we have Ibeyu, some of few key pieces of what's in the book. But this is the actual map that not I did not make, but I hired one of my grad students to make, because I realized that I cannot use ArcGIS for the life of me. And so I had wanted something that could show the kind of Atlantic expanse of the space that I'm looking through, not only in terms of like thinking about like the space, but also thinking about temporality. And here I'm thinking, kind of about the way that both Sylvia Winter and Nishitani Osama argue that part of the colonial endeavor of moving across space was also not just a spatial endeavor, but a temporal endeavor, so that in the crossing of the Atlantic, they transform space into time. So moving across the Atlantic, they imagined that they had gone back in time to see a kind of pre-modern people, right, a prehistoric people. And in that way, to think about cartographies in different ways, to look at space and to look at time and to challenge and to create new kinds of alliances, new kinds of relationships across the Atlantic, both through thinking through this like kind of government apparatus that is the ArcGIS, right? It is a government tool, and so we have to be careful what kinds of digital humanities tools we use, but also through the kinds of arts. So the opening, the cover of the book, the opening image, the Maria Magdalena Campos Pon's piece, that is also a cartography, that is also a map, right? And so in the project, I'm looking closely at these places. The Caribbean, something that we might be more used to seeing. So here we have these, archipelagic formations, and then Equatorial Guinea, which is a piece of the continent and also 5 islands. In and of itself is also an archipelagic formation. And thinking about the ways that the writing that is coming from the diaspora, coming from these experiences of exile, are speaking back and speaking about these experiences from these places. And I'm always reminded of what Mayra Santos Febre says about Puerto Rico. The writer Mayra Santos Febre said in Festival de la Palabra many years ago, like, Puerto Rico es chiquito, pero el mundo cabe en él, right? And to think about the kinds of worldviews that emerge from islands and from the archipelago, right, from these archipelagic spaces and their diasporas, right? The ways that we carry these islands with us, and are able to bring in an entire world, right? Through language, through practices, through our arts, right? And so I was really interested in creating a relationship, or not even creating, but actually like examining the relationship, the long history, the kind of the history of Spanish colonialism that ties us through language, the history of the Spanish-American War on the one side of the world that then has real, actual material impacts for what becomes Spanish Guinea, right? The impacts of dictatorship, and what happens, what forms of insurgency and resistance and violence takes place, right, across the Atlantic from these particular kinds of spaces that have these long relationships. The history of emancipated Cuban slaves, right, who are deported from the Caribbean to Equatorial Guinea or to Spanish Guinea. The history of anti-colonial agitators from Cuba, from the Philippines, right? Some from Puerto Rico, right? Very few, that are deported and serve in a penal colony, right? Or to work in a penal colony in Equatorial Guinea. All of these histories come together in the palimpsestic form, right? And one of the things that I realized was I was contending with the kind of anti-Blackness of Latinx studies, right? The kinds of ways that we turn away from Africa, the kind of ways that we attend to Afro-descendancy as, as watered down as possible, right? How we think about Blackness in folkloric contexts, right? Um, and how like Afro-Latinx studies and Afro-Latinos and Black Latinos are really on the periphery of what is marginal, right? And so use the work of Ciro Torres-Rodríguez and Ramon Hernandez, right? What does it mean to be on the periphery of the margins, right? On the one end, not only in the context of like our lived experiences under two kind of racial regimes, right? Mestizaje and hypodescent, if we're thinking about diasporic overlapping forms of racialization, but also intellectually, right? Scholarly, thinking about the ways that in Black studies, kind of English and French are kind of reign supreme as the languages of Blackness. In Latinx studies, how Black and Indigenous Latinidades are kind of shown very little space and oftentimes with a big huff. I mean, I don't know, I haven't seen the new Wakanda movie, but I don't know if you've seen, people are like, the Mexican media is having a shit fit, right, about like a kind of darker skinned, Mexican actor being in this film, and this is a long-standing issue. So we could think about colorism, racism, anti-indigeneity, anti-Blackness, right, across a series of different ways. That's just one thing that came to my head. But then we also see that, I remember like early on in my studies that I think this has changed significantly. I think this venue is one of the spaces where we could see the change. But I remember being in, as an undergrad, being in Spanish departments and even early in my graduate career going into conferences with folks who were doing Spanish studies or Hispanic studies, and them saying, well, we don't do the Caribbean or Latin America because they study themselves. Right, they study themselves. We're not really interested in that. And I was like, okay, I'll just go study myself then. Okay, so, but I think it's an interesting way to think about what happens on the periphery of the margin. And then in terms of Equatorial Guinea, we have a very similar thing happening, right? In terms of African studies, it's not taken up oftentimes. We often see it studied in linguistic studies and in Hispanic studies, which is incredible. But in terms of it being kind of quote unquote, not necessarily part of the African canon of literature, not necessarily accepted in Spain as like a national literature, even as it is produced by former colonial subjects, right? And not really brought into the conversation with the Caribbean and Latin America, even though we share a language and a colonial legacy. So again, on the periphery of the margins. I'm gonna try to speed it up because I don't have a lot of time, but you see how I'm meandering. I wanted to say that I am really, this is one of the images that's in my book, and it's called Of Islands and Other Mothers, and it is in a book called Nonstop Metropolis. It's an atlas of New York. And so in this map, what we see is the islands of Manhattan. Sorry, not Manhattan. Whew, that's like very Manhattan-centric. The islands of New York, right? Put together with the islands of the Caribbean, right? And for us, it's like a visual, like rendering, like visual for us, the kind of Caribbean migration, right? So we were actually to rethink New York City in the context of the population that lives in it and the people that carry home with them across generations, we would see something like this. And for me, thinking through archipelago studies and archipelagic formations and island studies necessarily takes me to the Pacific, to folks who have been doing this work for a long time, where I learned, kind of archipelago studies, thinking through the Peli Haufas, our Sea of Islands, and the work of Craig Santos Perez and Brandy Nalani McDougall and other folks who are thinking from the Pacific about Oceania, right? And about what it means to be part of this larger archipelago that goes against the kind of the kind of colonial formation as, a sea with many islands rather than an island of seas, right? So I have this kind of sense, and so here's where I'm thinking about archipelagos. I just wanted to shout that out and anchor that, because I think part of the kind of intellectual formation is that we're pulling, and many of us pull from the different places that we learn, and so in the different kinds of folks who are invested in work across a series of different geographic spaces and traditions, both like decolonial and anti-colonial traditions. I think it's so exciting for us to be able to learn from one another across this expanses and not just stay situated in our one place. I am also deeply impacted by the work of Jackie Alexander. I'm Jackie Alexander, and her way of thinking about pedagogies of crossing and the crossing. She says, this then is the existential message of the crossing to apprehend how it might instruct us in the urgent task of configuring new ways of being and knowing, and to plot the different metaphysics that are needed to move away from living alterity premised in difference to living intersubjectivity premised in relationality and solidarity. And so one of the things that I have thought about and write about in the book is thinking about relationality versus comparativity, even as I come out of a comparative ethnic studies program where we literally did comparison, which was very helpful. But for me, thinking about relationality through Caribbean context, right, through folks like Jackie Alexander, through Edward Glissant and Audre Lorde and other Caribbean thinkers was really helpful, because rather than say like it happened here and it happened there, right, and it in this way it went like this and this way it went like that, I was actually more interested in the kinds of thematics that emerged, not necessarily in exact situations, but in the spirit of resistance and the spirit of thinking back with and against the kind of colonial formation. Decolonial feminisms was also an important part of thinking through how to map an Atlantic project that wasn't reductive to the histories that I was studying, right? Like, so what does it mean that I'm looking at a long 500-year history of colonization in the Caribbean, and then I'm looking at a colonization that's happening in West Africa that happened until 1968, right? Something that is much more recent, and something that happened in something that of which the kinds of anti-colonial writing is ongoing, right? And also the contemporary writing against dictatorship and private indirect government. And so I was thinking about how to make sure that I wasn't creating kind of like a hierarchy of oppression and also engaging in histories in good faith without kind of being reductive. And so decolonial feminisms, I have here some quotes, have sought to think through and beyond the ways of colonial hierarchies of the human seek to fragment peoples categorically, and instead find ways to engage within difference and to find what Maria Lugones calls possible companions in resistance. And so I thought, who are companions in resistance? And are Latinx Caribbean people companions with Ecuadorianos? Are they, is it vice versa? Is it a relationship where we can find a companion in resistance to all these various forms of coloniality? And then I was thinking about Laura Perez's work, who's a Chicana art historian, who writes that a decolonizing politics must introduce, engage, and circulate previously unseen, marginalized, and stigmatized notions of spirituality, philosophy, gender, sexuality, art, or any other category of knowledge and existence. And so this gave me a plot point to where to start, right? So where do I begin in this project? And again, you hear me think about relationality. And so I have two pieces here from Audre Lorde. And so she says that the future of our earth depends on the ability of all women to identify and develop new definitions of power and new patterns of relating across difference. We have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. And because of this, we stand to be fractured from one another and ourselves. And she says this is not an easy task. This is a lifetime pursuit, right? It's a method of complex coalition building, of learning each other's histories, of understanding why differences fragments communities in search of liberation. And for me, thinking about relationality in this way was not just how do I do relationality on the page, but also, when I am attending to the literature, to the work, to the writers, and to the kinds of actions that they're taking up in the world, how do I engage ethically in that relation? And instead of reading it from the position of power, reading it from the position of an all-knowing scholar, right? Since I have, the carte blanche to close read and to give my critique, how do I actually listen instead and try to illuminate what already exists, right? Rather than trying to dictate how good or how bad it is and engaging in a kind of like hierarchy of critique. The other kind of key part of this was thinking through the critical cartographies of racialization. So bear with me. I went through a small crisis, right? And actually this was really, I keep shouting out Benita here, but Benita, I didn't get to work with her as a graduate student, but she's always been in my corner and reading drafts of my stuff. And one of the things that she always had me attend to was a question of different languages and intra-ethnic hierarchies within places, right? And so there's no way that I could read the literature of Equatorial Guinea as just one literature, right, of people who are so oppressed, right? But instead, I had to attend to the multiple languages, the kinds of power dynamics within and across ethnic groups in Guinea, and then also on the side of the Latinx Caribbean, I had to think about the ways that folks are racialized, right, as they move across different spaces, right? And so thinking about the kinds of, um, and again, one of the, I have so many stories, but I'm gonna try to stay here with you right here. Okay. But one of the things that I had to be really careful was like, okay, so when I go to Equatorial Guinea, there are languages happening and there's all these power dynamics and there's paramilitary police and there's all types of stuff going on. But when folks are in diaspora, in exile, in Spain, they're un negro como cualquiera, right? Those kinds of things in many ways cease to exist when the power dynamic, right, and the shift happens. And so what I wanted to kind of create was a kind of framework or matrix to be able to hold space for how people's identities and their subjective positions change depending on where they move to. And one example is when I, grew up in this area and I open my mouth and people know I'm Puerto Rican, whether I'm speaking English or Spanish. It's an accent thing or whatever the case may be. But when I went to grad school in California, I remember introducing myself in one of my first pedagogy seminars. And I was like, oh, my name is Yomaira. I'm Puerto Rican, whatever. Because if you're Puerto Rican, that's like the first thing you say. And then, and after my seminar, one of my classmates came up to me. He said, you know what? You need to leave that Puerto Rican shit behind because now you're in California and you're just black here. And I was like, okay, bet. I was like, interesting, right? Like, interesting that those things can't be the same, right? Like, and so this is, again, the critical cartographies of racialization. When you move across space, how you're interpolated, right? How you are seen as different. And so here, critical cartographies of racialization help us to hold space for the different ways that anti-blackness and the colonial difference, which is the hierarchizing of difference, imbue former colonies and contemporary metropoles. This relational cartography of racialization for Afro-Diasporic peoples outlines the unfixed racial, ethnic, ontological, and phenomenological experiences that emerge from moving across spatial and temporal locales. That is basically me trying to make, write concretely the experiences that I'm telling you about here, right? These are some of the books that I engage. Sorry, I just went really quickly. In the book, there was about 16 primary texts. I would never do this again. I promise you that, yeah. And anytime any of my students are like, I'm thinking that in chapter 1, I'm gonna do 4 novels, and I'm like, no, baby. No, baby, what you're not gonna do is that, yeah, never again. But it was, for me, it was really important to have like something from Equatorial Guinea in every chapter, trying to represent as many ethnic groups as possible, something from the Caribbean, right? And then I had like 3 nations, right, to represent from the Caribbean. And then I also had to think about like gender and sex and sexuality and all these different things, right? Like, so it was a lot of juggling, and then the visual art and the other things and the footnotes. The footnotes were like really, really long. My editor made me cut out, like I had like 100 pages of footnotes, and she was like, you have to stop playing games. And so, yeah, so this is some of the things that I wrote about. And so to kind of talk about the way that instead of like, I had all of these kinds of frameworks that I talked about a little bit before, right? And thinking about relationality, women of color, feminism, decolonization, right? All of these different kinds of politics. I'm doing literature and history and working in kind of an ethnic studies methodology to think about a new way of mapping relationships across Black Atlantic, privileging Black writers and privileging Black theory and Black theorists, right? And theorists of color. Right, primarily. I was interested in thinking, if I'm thinking about intimacy, I want to know what thinkers have thought about the conditions of Black women, right? And intimacy and power and violence, and using that language and that to make clear what's happening, what I see in the text. And so for me, that was the kind of interesting part of like mapping the relations, was also who do we bring along in the journey to examine the work, right? Rather than kind of leaning on the folks that might give us a little bit more play, if that makes sense. I had someone read, I worked out my chapter Intimacies one year, and one of the feedback that I got was like, this would really circulate so much better, like in the world, if you would just like use Foucault instead and just make Foucault. And I was like, okay, cool, thank you. But that's the kind of thing, right? Like that's, and I'm not trying to make it. I just want to say like concretely, like that's the kinds of feedback sometimes we get. Okay, so the relations chapter is where I like kind of mapped out now that these kinds of long historical, literary, poetic relations, thinking about all of the different kinds of areas of study that helped me to make sense of the project. I talk about intimacies and the corporeal consciousness and Black femme freedom, and the ways that these emerge in the face of intimate forms of domination and control, both colonial and dictatorial. I argue in that chapter that if there's so much resistance and there's so much beauty amid the violence and amid the kinds of the constant presence of coloniality and dictatorship. Who is seeing this? Like, who gets to see what's happening in this literature? Who gets to read it? Who is reading it for more than just aesthetic purposes or more than just pleasure? And I move into the question of witnessing, and I build on the kind of concept of faithful witnessing, a decolonial feminist philosophical concept that has a much longer history in terms of thinking about particular forms of witnessing and attitudes. So like Habermas, Husserl, all these other folks, right? Like thinking about the transcendental attitude, the natural attitude, the decolonial attitude, thinking about witnessing versus recognition. And so there's a whole kind of long philosophical engagement. But one of the things that I say is like, this is not just philosophy, but this is a practice of standing in the way of harm. For one another, right? For other people, this is a practice that women of color have practiced since time immemorial. What does it mean to second and to third something that you did not see but you believe, right? That you know to be true because you trust, and you decide that being a faithful witness, that is a moment that you decide to walk away from all logic, right? Particular kinds of colonial logic, to stand alongside and oftentimes even in front of someone who might be harmed. I argue that if faithful witnessing is probably the precondition for any decolonial politic, the kind of form of interrelationality that is like concretely part of your being, then perhaps one of the first things we need to witness is destierro. And for me, this is a way to think through the kinds of impossibility of exile and diaspora. And when you're writing about exile and diaspora, you have to clarify, like, I know that exile is different than diaspora, and I know that, and you might have to say that like 50 times, right? But the point is that the kind of colonial modernity has this long history of tearing peoples out of their homelands and placing them in other places and extracting their labor and their lives and their resources and creating a system of destierro, of being torn forcefully from the earth, not only in terms of like their bodies and labor, but their language, their lands, their foods, their practices, their cosmologies, but that this is not an all-encompassing situation, but rather this is something that has been constantly and continually fought against by folks, right? Black and indigenous people and their descendants. And so that destierro is both the act of being torn away from land, but also the act of continually recuperating and fighting against that, and in a series of kind of phenomenological experiences. And that if destierro is part of what we are constantly fighting as folks who are colonial subjects and the descendants of a world and a modernity that is built on violence and war, then what does reparations look like? Not just in the material sense, because yes, we are owed money, but that the money and the land and the things are not necessarily the concrete gains, because when we are able to reduce harms done to a dollar amount or to a square footage or acreage of land, and when we accept that, then the state or the empire, whatever, could be like, yo, we said we're sorry. And we gave you $8,000 for selling your mom. Why are you mad? Right? And so for me, I'm thinking about reparations beyond the material, because as we agitate for material reparations, one of the things that we might need to engage with because of destierro and because of the ways that we are torn away and on other people's lands is the kinds of reparation of the imagination, right? The reparation of like our relationships with other people, our experiences of both oftentimes being in collusion with power, right? And disempowering other people through our own presence on unceded territories and lands, and in all kinds of other ways, right? All kinds of other ways. And so for me, thinking about reparations is thinking through the ways that the literature offers us different modes and different ways to think about reparations that does not only rely on material gains, right? And thinking about reparations, also thinking about futurities, right? The reparation of the imagination. What do we want our futures to look like? And that's where I end with Apocalypso, with a kind of meditation on the sacred, on Santeria, and also the second part of that chapter looks at the end of worlds, Apocalypso's the kind of like sci-fi, the earth is like crushing in on itself. And what's really interesting to me is that in the work from the Dominican Republic and from Equatorial Guinea, in both of those works, at the end of that chapter, it's a young, like a black girl. A black girl is the only thing that can save the world from this kind of implosion, right? So I'm thinking about, what do futurities look like in Afro-Atlantic context, right? Afrofuturism, basically, right? But a kind of label that I didn't want to put on the work, just because I have the power to do so, right? And then I end with a kind of meditation on the sea, thinking about the sea and the celestial, thinking about the poetry of Raquel Lomé del Pozo Epita, which, by the way, Benita has done a beautiful translation of that work. And then also of Araceli Shirmay, and also a reading of Maria Magdalena Campos Pons de las Dos Aguas. And I think about the way that relation has worked through the sea in each one of the chapters, and that it opens up a space for us to think about the sea as a possibility for relation, and in that case, bringing us back to the opening chapter in a kind of like cyclical form. So the kind of, and this is the last slide because I think I'm way overdue. Okay, is that what fuels this project is decolonial love, and this is something that I theorized and define in the book multiple times in multiple ways, because I don't think there's one definition to encompass it. And so here's two quotes: decolonial love as future work, envisaged through our past, is necessarily a technology for social transformation, and is a method through which we can reimagine human being as praxis. Decolonial love manifests as attention to 1492, to the past before it, the past since, the subterranean roots created by it, and the dead beneath the sea. It can be imagined as looking into the vast and inconsolable sea to make visible what was disappeared and to make perceptible futurities beyond colonization. And I'm done. Thank you.
Well, first, before I thank a lot of people, I would like to say that I love your post-baby mind. It was really thought-provoking to hear you, and I'm also already like making some connections between your presentation and what I'm going to be talking about today. So first I wanted to thank Jordana and Laura for putting this panel together. It's really exciting to be presenting with Yomaira and Paulina, and also with Laura as commentator. So it's today I will be talking about my book as well, Intercolonial Intimacies, but I will only be focusing on maybe one of the chapters or two of the chapters, because when I was first in contact with Jordan, I wanted to take this as an opportunity to think or sort of jump to like my next project, which is very difficult after having finished one. So it is sort of my initial steps towards this new research project. And as Laura had mentioned, Laura Torres-Rodríguez, my new project is centering more on Rapa Nui, but today I will be talking about Craig Santos Perez from Guam that Yomaira already has mentioned. So, transmodernity, Sur-South, the Spanish Pacific, the Latin American Pacific, the global Hispanophone. As of late, a number of conceptual frameworks or fields of research that go beyond the traditional boundaries of Hispanic and Latin American studies have emerged alongside a return of global approaches to our objects of study. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the past years, there's global everything, right? I come from a small university, and already there's a new global Center for Global Studies and also a minor in global studies. So I think it's here to stay. It is no longer assumed that globality refers to the links between a center and its peripheries, that is, between metropole and colonies. Alongside a continual dismantling of the idea of a one-world world, there has been growing research interest in the intricate networks of relationships between the worlds of the so-called peripheries of the Hispanic world. In regard to the emerging field of global Hispanophone studies, Adolfo Campoy Cubillo and Benita San Pedro Vizcaya, who is here, they propose the following. The global Hispanophone does not have to be driven by a centripetal force that links its diverse corpus to a Hispanophone core or essence. Instead, we have an opportunity to fashion this field as a centrifugal force that allows its subject of study away from the infelicitous essentialisms that have characterized past renditions of Hispanism. So in today's presentation, I would like to linger a little bit on this centrifugal movement. And I will do this through an examination of the role of the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, the round trip of the trade, you see it here. It's very blurry. I will come back to it. So through the Manila galleon trade, I will establish how the Spanish Empire from early on was already a decentered, if not polycentric, world. I will then turn to the rise of trans-Pacific studies. There was maybe a rise and fall, but I think it's still on the rise. How I have engaged with trans-Pacific studies in my book, and some of the possibilities and limitations that emerge from this interdisciplinary field. And finally, we'll offer a brief analysis of a few poems by contemporary Chamorro writer Craig Santos Perez that center on the Pacific, or more specifically, the islands of the Pacific. But first, I would like to, as I promised, to talk a little bit more about this map and also another early map of the Pacific. So from 1513 onward, the Spanish Empire began to declare itself owner of the Pacific Ocean, or Mar del Sur, a Spanish explorer, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, called the immense ocean he encountered on the southern end of the Panama Isthmus. This claim adhered to the demarcations of the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, wherein Spain and Portugal basically divided the world in halves. However, it was a claim to the unknown. The Spanish were declaring themselves owner of a vast space that exceeded their imagination. So they tried to contain the unknown. In this map from 1575 by Spanish cartographer Juan López de Velasco, titled Demarcación y Navegaciones de Indias, the image of the Pacific is blurry, but it looks, I think you will agree with me, unquestionably very small. The mythical continent of Terra Australis contributes to making it look manageable and also even domesticated. It looks like a lake, or even like a little pool that one can easily cross. So it evokes the principle of mare clausum, defended by Spain and Portugal during the so-called Age of Discovery. You know, this idea that this belongs to us, this is small, we can handle this. Within a few years, the Spanish Empire was more comfortable claiming the Pacific. So here's another map, also by the official Spanish cartographer, official for the Spanish crown, Juan López de Velasco, and this one is from 1601, in which the main focus, the center, is the Americas, in particular New Spain. Europe, the tip of Portugal, barely makes it into this map. Nonetheless, the cartouche clarifies any doubts a viewer may have about Spain's possession of this ocean, which now looks a little bigger, right, than the previous one. The cartouche reads, "Contained between the two indicated meridians is the navigation and discovery that is incumbent of the Castilians." And if we look at the title of this map, it is noteworthy that the Philippines, the far east from a European point of view, is presented as part of the Indias Occidentales, or West Indies. So it's seen as the extreme west. As Ricardo Padrón, who has studied the maps of Velasco in detail, points out, Velasco, quote, pulls off a powerful discursive and cartographic conquest of the Pacific that allows the Indies of the West to emerge in the Spanish imagination as a new imperial frontier, end quote. So in the coming years, Spain would explore and come to know the Pacific better through the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, which would, I should have put a map of the galleon trade, but I think by now I think you can imagine it. So it had begun officially in 1565, and it went on to last for 2.5 centuries. Yet as of late, historians have been arguing that it is somewhat of a stretch to say that the Spanish crown was in control of the trans-Pacific galleon trade. While some contend that the Chinese were practically in charge of it, I remember one time I gave a presentation and there were a lot of Chinese scholars, and they were like, yeah, but that was actually, this was ours, this trade, you know, like, what are you talking about, no? But for the sake of clarity today, I would like to focus on another view. Following historian Mariano Ardas Bonialian, during the first years of the galleon trade, a triangular commerce developed as products from Asia circulated freely from New Spain to Peru. This trade soon became lucrative, becoming a cause for concern for merchants across the Atlantic. So in response to these merchants' complaints, the Spanish crown suspended the traffic of Asian goods from New Spain to Peru, and this was in 1634. This law, however, was not enforced. Merchants continued to smuggle goods from the Manila galleon to Peru throughout the 17th century. The Pacific was theoretically a Spanish lake, but for all practical matters, it was, Bonialian insists, a Spanish-American lake. And this comes from a study from Bonialian that's titled El Pacífico Hispanoamericano. As the galleon trade depended on silver mine in Mexico and Peru, the Spanish colonies across the Pacific continued to develop a relationship largely unmediated by Spain. Ignoring the royal decrees, merchants from New Spain and the Philippines continued to transport more goods than what was allowed by the law. This is what makes the Manila galleon trade, in the words of another historian, Carmen Yuste Lopez, She calls it la más importante alternativa de carácter intercolonial en el conjunto del mundo hispánico, the most important intercolonial alternative in the entire Hispanic world. So although the Pacific was claimed by the Spanish crown, the commercial networks across it remained largely in the hands of merchants from the colonies throughout the 18th century. Yuste López maintains that el eje transpacífico no fue en efecto un Pacífico de los Ibéricos, fue sin lugar a dudas un Pacífico intercolonial, un océano de intercambios en el que filipinos y novohispanos sacaron el mayor provecho. So, in my book, Intercolonial Intimacies, I focus on literary works produced after 1898. However, I rely a lot on the work of Bonilla and Yuste López. Their work sort of enables me to argue that 20th century Latin American and Filipino writers and intellectuals evoked the Spanish colonial past primarily as an intercolonial past. I contend that their nostalgia for the empire is one that is riddled with a desire to legitimize the connection between the Americas and Asia. It's not unproblematic, but I think this is when they speak about the Manila Galleon, as the sort of the legendary Manila Galleon, they're kind of thinking about how it was such an intimate link between the two. This imperial nostalgia, moreover, is a yearning to be seen as always already global by way of the Pacific. In one of the chapters, I delve into Mexican writer and diplomat Rafael Bernal and his El Gran Océano, which is a book that is devoted entirely to the Pacific. Bernal died in 1972 before completing this book, yet some critics of Bernal still consider it his magnum opus. El Gran Océano has a longue durée approach. It begins long before the arrival of European colonizers and devotes itself to the successive and competing imperial powers that have claimed the Pacific in its entirety, like Spain, or in strategic parts, and also the Pacific Rim. It begins with the Java man, which scientists say that it's the oldest akin to human beings. Then he talks about the constant maritime migrations of Orang Laut, or sea peoples from the southern Malay peninsula. Orang Laut means sea peoples. And signs of commercial activities in present-day China and the Americas. So I'm going to skip over, all the chapters instead of summarizing all of the book. The final chapter of El Gran Océano narrates a series of events from the second half of the 19th century, among them Spain's attempts to recover its territorial claim to the Pacific coast in South America, Chile's efforts to spread its frontiers across the Pacific, and the German and Spanish interest in the Philippines, the Marianas, and the Marshall Islands. So I was very interested when I came across this information that Chile, for instance, was claiming that they wanted to help out the Filipinos, which is obviously a very strategic claim to want to expand its frontiers. At some point in my book, based primarily on El Gran Océano, I declare Bernal a pioneer in the field of trans-Pacific studies. But these days, I have been rethinking my approach to trans-Pacific studies and whether Bernal's approach to the Pacific is one that I subscribe to. And this in part has to do with the fact that, sometimes I'm very excited about the Trans-Pacific, and then I go to some conferences where the Trans-Pacific is really more like economically interested, and so I have like a complicated relationship to it, as I imagine other scholars in Trans-Pacific studies as well do. In the past decades, several academic publications, research centers, and academic programs have been turning their eye to the Pacific, or more specifically, to the Asia-Pacific region and to trans-Pacific studies. In part, the conflation of Asia and the Pacific and the emerging field of trans-Pacific studies can be understood as a response to inter-areal approaches that tended to focus almost exclusively on connections between the Americas and Europe. Perhaps more visibility has been given to the Pacific, yet trans-Pacific studies has tended to focus on the Pacific Rim. As the name of the field itself suggests, scholars of trans-Pacific studies tend to see the Pacific as a space merely to be crossed, an ahistorical and almost uninhabited ocean still waiting to form part of the world order. In El Gran Océano, Bernal acknowledges the presence of different peoples that inhabit the Pacific, and yet he ends up referring to the islands of the Pacific as, quote, an enormous catalog of dispersed ethnographic curiosities, end quote. And when I was finishing my book, and I had to turn in a final version, I kind of wanted to add some comments about like his approach to the Pacific as I was realizing it more. So I was only able to put it in the footnotes, right? So he does not think that they are worth studying, the islands in the Pacific or Pacific Islanders, as he's more interested in the presence of European and Western imperial powers in the Pacific. So by casting doubt in Bernal's focus in his otherwise tremendously ambitious study of the Pacific, I'm not suggesting that any Hispanist or Latin Americans who wishes to engage with the Pacific must become a specialist in all the cultures encompassed by the Pacific. It's practically impossible. Instead, I am proposing that something needs to be fundamentally changed in the way we view or even imagine the Pacific. As Tongan Fijian writer Epeli Hauofa, that Yomaira also mentioned, so as he observes, quote, there is a world of difference between viewing the Pacific as islands in a far sea and as a sea of islands, end quote. The first one, islands in a far sea, relies on a Eurocentric point of view of the Pacific. The Pacific is in the margins of the world. The second one, Sea of Islands, not only centers on the Pacific, but it highlights the particularity of islands, however minute they may appear on a global scale. And in fact, an island-centered view of the Pacific forces us to let go of the very idea of global scale, which reinforces the notion of a one-world world. Chamorro poet and critic Craig Santos Perez also contests this imperial gaze to which the Pacific has been subjected by turning to numerous cartographic representations of Guam. His volume, From Unincorporated Territory Hacha, which is the first volume of a tetralogy, starts off with a preface on how Guam is mapped. He says, on some maps, Guam doesn't exist. I point to an empty space in the Pacific and say, I'm from here. On some maps, Guam is a small unnamed island. I say, I'm from this unnamed place. On some maps, Guam is named Guam, USA. I say, I'm from a territory of the United States. On some maps, Guam is simply named Guam. I say, I am from Guam, end quote. Unsatisfied by the mere recognition of the existence of his land on a map, Santos Perez sets out to question the predominantly militarized and commercial cartographic representations of the Pacific and Guam. The poems, or poem maps, as he calls them in From Unincorporated Territory Hacha, consist of collages of excerpts from legal, historical, and military documents, visual illustrations, literary texts, and maps, lots of maps. So here to give you an idea, they include a nautical chart that depicts the routes of the Spanish galleon trade, a World War II map from the US Military Academy, another map from World War II, but this time it's a map of Guam, which like the Philippines, like Manila, was captured by the Japanese and recaptured by the US in 1944. A map of US military bases, another World War II map of Guam, only this time one from a historical park of the war, a map that reveals or hints at how toxic waste is impacting biodiversity, as this map concerns the patterns of decline of brown tree snakes in Guam. And finally, the volume ends with a map that places Guam at the center. And one says, okay, well, great, finally Guam is at the center. But the joke, and Santos Perez is somewhat funny throughout the collection, but the joke is that this is a map from actually from United Airlines, and now the defunct Continental Airlines. So Guam is featured as an important center. It is an important hub, but it clearly indicates that commercial interests are profoundly tied to military interests, to a history of military interests. So I know I went very fast with this map, so I bring your attention to a few of them now in reverse, this time focusing on the literary experts that accompany them. Sorry. So a line, for instance, from Chilean artist-poet Cecilia Vicuña from Kipoema, which is what I argue, which arguably is something that inspires Santos Perez to come up with this concept of poem maps. Lines by Martinican poet Aimé Césaire that evokes islands as defiant scars or wounds in the water, and Brazilian writer Oswald de Andrade's obsessive evocation of routes. Altogether, these maps and excerpts invite us to search for meaning, as fleeting or meaningless as it may seem, in minute relations. This is what it calls us to do. It is also evident that for Santos Perez, literature can operate like an archive of missing narratives and should therefore be taken seriously alongside the overwhelming array of imperial sources. Other maps in Hacha further call on the reader to hear and link dispersed words, voices, languages, and signs. The first poem of the collection, for instance, is composed of sets of words followed by tildes, the wavy sign. I just learned that it's called tilde, but it makes sense that that's the name, right? From a distance, these loose signifiers evoke Epeli Hauofa's image of the Pacific as a sea of islands. If we read closely, we realize that the words in this poem consist of the name Guam has received and some of its pronunciations or distortions. Guam is actually a distortion of the native name Guahan, which Jesuit friar Diego Luis de San Vitores renamed Marianas alongside other nearby islands after Queen of Spain Mariana of Austria. Thieves Island, or Isla de los Ladrones, is the name given by Guam by Magellan and his crew members in 1521. The day when they arrived in Guam, the natives approached the ship and took some of the crew members' possessions. And so this is why the name they gave is Isla de los Ladrones. But what is less told is that in response to what they perceived as theft, the next day Magellan's crew burned down an entire village. Linking the imposed meanings of Guahan and this untold violent initial encounter, or not told enough a narrative, a few pages later there is a visual excerpt, and it's an engraving of Father San Vitores, the one who renamed the island Marianas, about to be killed by indigenous village chiefs Matapang and Jurao. This scene forms part of the Chamorro revolt against Spanish rule in the second half of the 17th century. The visual depiction of Matapang as murderer is complemented by the following commentary. The shrine of Father San Vitores shows him baptizing Chief Pang's newborn daughter, despite the fact that Matapang did not give him permission. The baby is held by her mother, and Matapang is shown from behind yielding his machete. Juxtaposing these two illustrations of Matapang as a thread always holding this machete, Santos Perez adds another comment, but after an asterisk, as if it were maybe an afterthought or maybe sort of a footnote. After the death of San Vitores, the native population collapsed from 200,000 to 5,000 in 2 generations as a result of Spanish military conquest. As such, Santos Perez wants us to see how the violence against the Chamorros is either normalized to the point of oblivion or to be footnoted, while Chamorro violence upon the Spanish is spectacularized, hence functioning as a sort of justification of the need to tame the natives through Christianizations. As probably many of you know, the work of the missions was euphemized as a pacification or as a spiritual conquest. To conclude, it is worthwhile to mention that throughout Hacha, Craig Santos Perez inserts a few words in Spanish and plenty in Chamorro. At times he offers translations of these Chamorro words, but most times he does not. As such, he dares us to experience a bit of the unsettlement of not knowing, or rather not being able to know, what we are reading. In the end, Santos Perez invites us to question the narratives that are presented in imperial archives and cartographies, and to pay attention to those narratives that are not only silent but silenced. Much like Edward Said, who proposed that we read colonial texts contrapuntally, considering the perspectives of both the colonizer and the colonized, Santos Perez calls for an acknowledgement of what escapes the archives and what cannot be mapped. By consistently exposing and interrogating the US and previous Spanish claims of Guam, Santos Perez's poem maps caution us against conflating the Pacific not only with America, with the US, but also with Latin America and Asia. His poem maps are a call for us scholars seeking to engage with the Pacific, whether from Hispanic studies, Latin American studies, or American studies, to let go of our view of a distant Pacific in need to be captured in a map, however Pacific-centric the map in our heads may presume to be. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank Jordana and Laura for organizing this really wonderful panel, and I'm just so excited to be part of this discussion, and I've been inspired by the works of everyone here, and it's just such a pleasure. So I'm going to start with an image. This is the Barrier Gate. So this is taken in Macau, right at the border between Macau and the People's Republic of China. And so the Barrier Gate was built in 1573 during the Ming Dynasty. And this here is the renovation from 1849. And it stands in front of the contemporary border between the PRC and Macau. And so this is a really nice image to think about some of the things I'm going to be talking about today, which is largely about these extraterritorial borderland spaces and the work of aesthetics in mediating political boundaries, aesthetics and memory. And so the saying there, it roughly translates to "the homeland honors us." In 1951, Portugal changed the status of Macau from colony to overseas province. A few years later, in 1958, the Director General of Ministry of Overseas Provinces wrote a memo to express his preoccupation with negative representations of Macau in the media, which he stated, cast doubt on Portuguese sovereignty over Macau. He was referring to US depictions of Macau as a forbidden city, a place where US military personnel could not go on the grounds that it had become a center of espionage, where American citizens had been taken prisoner by Chinese communists. Throughout the 20th century, concerns over representations of Macau were tied to issues regarding sovereignty. Stories of Macau depicted it as a two-faced society. It was simultaneously a destination for colonial tourism and a haven for Chinese refugees. And this is just an image, I'll just leave it up, from the Portuguese from the 16th century. Travel tourism to Macau was exemplary of larger projects of European cultural production that encouraged colonial travel as a means to justify efforts to maintain overseas empires. Tourism to colonial possessions during the 19th century and onwards was a means of spreading propaganda and defining emergent European nationalisms during decolonization efforts. Under Portuguese dictator António Salazar, his government, the Estado Novo, created the Office of the National Propaganda Secretariat to oversee colonial tourism as a means to fortify national identity and give the Portuguese state authority over cultural heritage and monuments. Macau's ambiguous geopolitical status during most of its history, particularly in face of the rise of nationalist movements during the 20th century, complicated Portuguese colonial tourism and propaganda efforts. The small piece of land was a buffer zone to two Chinas, the communist government of Mao Zedong and the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. British attempts to gain a monopoly on the commerce in the South China Seas, and Portuguese desires to hold on to extraterritorial privileges in face of global pressures to decolonize. One journalist writing in 1962 for the Japanese English language newspaper, the Mainichi, described Macau as having a double life. He added that Macau was also known as the 6 square mile city, the oldest existing European colony in the Far East. It was a center for gambling tourism and a refugee haven for people fleeing communist China. It was the Monte Carlo of the Orient and the city of the name of God. According to the same article, Portuguese government officials estimated that more than 250 refugees were arriving in Macau per day. Many of them are aged, halt, or infirm and have, Portuguese officials believe, been issued exit visas by Chinese authorities in order to reduce the population pressures in such overcrowded cities as Canton. Many are penniless when they arrive, and it is estimated that some 20% of Macau's population now consists of refugees with tuberculosis, the article stated. The multiple faces of Macau in media representations and diplomatic, here's just a travel magazine. The multiple faces of Macau in media representations and diplomatic accounts provide insight on the work of ambiguity as a functional procedure of colonial renewal in face of 20th century calls for decolonization. Macau's equivocal sovereignty presents a special but not unique case for better understanding the structural role that ambiguity and exceptions play in making claims to territory, memory, and history. To discuss the various dimensions of colonial dismembering that structures Macau's history, I bring together some current research I've been doing in these archives and concerning the fraught status of Macau during the 20th century. Ambiguous territorial statuses and borders are characteristic of Iberian imperialism in Asia. Accordingly, Macau, a relatively small piece of land but crucial geostrategic zone, offers an important point of entry to analyzing extraterritorial topics in Luso-Hispanic Asia. The Portuguese overseas empire was not a coherent or consistent entity, and Portuguese colonial history in Asia resembled a hydra more than a leviathan. Consequently, the equivocal nature of sovereignty is a historical feature and governing structure of Macau, particularly during 20th century imperatives to decolonize in face of imperialist attempts at repartitioning Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Battles to define Macau's status were tied to larger Portuguese concerns over maintaining colonial territories around the world, particularly in Africa and Goa, India. Colonial restructuring was not only waged in wars, but also in contests for cultural memory and historical narratives, wherein securing the past also meant gaining control of the South China Seas and gateway to the Chinese economy. The Portuguese Empire in the South China Seas is a vital yet often overlooked chapter in the history of globalization and the making of the modern world order. Over the last decade, historians and literary scholars have begun to recuperate histories of the Spanish and Portuguese Pacific, establishing many avenues for future research. For many, the Portuguese Empire was the first and last European empire, beginning in 1415 with the conquest of Ceuta in North Africa and coffining in the handover of Macau to China in 1999. The year 1492 acts as a Schenectady for the Spanish invasion of the Americas that initiated a world historical transformation, in which the trade in natural and cultural materials, human labor, and wars over religion and territory expanded to a global level. However, this narrative about Spanish imperialism in the Americas overshadows the centrality of Portuguese colonial expansion in the Pacific, as it set out to be the first European empire to find the quickest sea routes to the sea and spice trade in Asia. Portuguese seafaring militarism was a key player in globalizing economies and histories around the world through advancing narratives of social ascension vis-a-vis racial and religious miscegenation, with the goal of spreading ideas about civilization via ideologies of racial whitening and militarized Catholicism. The Portuguese Empire was central to the expansion of the global African slave trade. And here's just some images of the two faces of Macau. Historian Ming Chang argues that Portugal's uninterrupted presence in Macau for 4 centuries is partly due to its non-confrontational approach. Unlike the British, Portugal did not engage with gunboat diplomacy to control Macau. British imperialism in China took a different direction from the Portuguese. Until the Friendship and Trade Treaty between Portugal and Macau in 1887, Macau was an entrepôt for ships sailing between Lisbon and Nagasaki. Legal historian Camões Tam observes that the 1887 treaty contained a deliberate ambiguity to confuse the issue of sovereignty over Macau. In the Chinese version regarding possession of Macau, the phrase is perpetual establishment and government, while the English and Portuguese versions read perpetual occupation and government. For China, the Portuguese were renting Macau for perpetual establishment and government under Chinese authorization. For Portugal, Macau was a place of establishment, a colony, which had been granted them by the Chinese emperor. This calculated ambiguity led to a century-long dispute over the status of Macau's international status. In 1987, Portugal and China reached the agreement that Macau would return to China in 1999. Camões Tam argues that from the perspective of international law and the principle of prescription, and here he gets really technical about the law, but the main idea is that Portugal gained possession or gained rights to being there through what you would call goodwill and peace. So if Portugal were to have been violent, they would have lost their control over Macau. And so in international law, the way to think about it is that violence was not an acceptable form of maintaining sovereignty. So then how do you maintain sovereignty if violence is not an option? So ultimately, Camões' goal is to argue that Macau was Chinese territory under Portuguese administration. However, I'm interested in his interpretation that goodwill and peace must be added to prescription for durational possession to be applicable, since this observation offers a way to understand the function of aesthetics and affect in shaping or disfiguring delimitations, including claims to sovereignty when violence would have nullified Portuguese claims to Macau. I want to turn our attention to the cultural battles weighed in aesthetics and affect rather than in violence. The aesthetics of Macau, including mass media representations of Macau, became battlegrounds for forging cultural memory and historical narratives. Portugal and China negotiated the Macau question across aesthetic realms, wherein battles to control visual and literary representations of Macau were concerned with a slew of issues, including the abolition of European extraterritorial rights in China end to Western imperialism, tensions between nationalist and communist China, and Macanese autonomy. During the Portuguese dictatorship under Antonio Salazar, who governed from 1932 to 1968, Portuguese officials and allies engaged in cultural memory battles to secure Portuguese colonies around the world. In these aesthetic battles, they evoked nationalist sentiment, characteristic of the Portuguese literary movement Saudosismo, which was at once a religious, aesthetic, political set of beliefs that emerged in the early 20th century, aimed at defining and defending the Lusitanian race. As a political aesthetic, Saudosismo stimulates affective registers like nostalgia and melancholy to defend Portugal's attempt at colonial renewal. Saudosismo is also a tool of racialization in how it associates affective states like longing and racial and religious with racial and religious and nationalist ideals. In regards to Macau, it evoked longing, nostalgia, and homesickness to create a political affect about Portugal's rightful home in Macau. Also during the 20th century, Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire developed the concept that Brazil was a racial democracy. His theory of racial democracy posits that Portuguese colonists, in contrast with European colonists, acclimated well to semi-tropical and tropical climates, a trait which gave them the unique ability to assimilate local customs, languages, and religions into Lusophone culture. And this is his quote. By their Portuguese genius in combining civilized and indigenous values, they had been able, perhaps better than any other people of predominantly European origin, to adapt a European civilization to the tropics. Freire's social theories struck a chord with Salazar, and he adapted Freire's ideas to justify ongoing Portuguese colonialism in Africa and Asia during the 20th century. Diplomatic correspondences about Macau were often stamped with the words Política África, African politics, attesting to how Portugal viewed Africa and Asia as part of a connected project of colonial renewal. Salazar's regime sponsored Freire on a world tour of Portuguese colonialism. In 1951, Freire visited Goa, where he affirmed his social theories that the Portuguese could acclimate exceptionally well to the tropics, therein leading naturally to miscegenation and cultural hybridity between Portuguese and local languages, religions, and cultures. Freire's vision of Goa was limited, partly due to his unawareness of Goan histories of resistance to Portuguese rule. In addition, his tour guides were wealthy Goans with Portuguese origins and Catholic elites with Indian ancestry. During his world tour of Portuguese imperialism and invasion, he expanded his concept of racial democracy to a concept he called Lusotropicalism, which puts forth the notion that Portuguese imperialism was spread through interrelated biological and cultural processes of racial miscegenation, religious conversion, and cultural encounters. These aspects produced a distinct kind of lusotropical culture in which the Portuguese colonies are united by their ties to Portuguese language, religion, and culture. Felipe da Silva and Manuel Villaverde Cabral argue that lusotropicalism is a social theory as opposed to a sociological theory because of Freire's reliance on rhetoric and writing style to achieve content. Saudosismo and lusotropicalism were political aesthetic forms that relied heavily on nostalgic representations as a nonviolent recourse to making claims to extraterritorial rights. During the 1950s, Portugal made plans to develop tourism in Macau, eliciting moods like sentimentalism, nostalgia, and melancholy. The Secretary of State for Overseas Territories, engineer Carlos Abecasis, stated that Portugal was not in Macau to make money. He said, "We are there for historical and sentimental reasons." In regards to these plans to work in conjunction with Hong Kong and American interests, he continued, "Macau's income more or less balanced ordinary operating expenses, but extra expenses for the care of refugees, developmental programs, and new schools and hospitals had to come from metropolitan Portugal." Also reporting on Abecasis' comments about the sentimental reasons for investing in tourism, the Hong Kong Tiger Standard added, "The money will go for land reclamation projects. new industries, and continued expansion of school and hospital facilities. Reporting on Portugal's plans to turn Macau into a tourist destination, the Bangkok World called it the tiny Portuguese colony on the South China coast, the oldest European settlement in the Far East. The reporter states, once the Asian headquarters for pirates and soldiers of fortune, Macau is still an exotic place. Any evening on the terrace of the Posada Hotel, one can glimpse Portuguese girls in high-collared gowns dancing to American music with men in turbans and tropical wines. A reporter for the Singaporean journal, the Sunday Times, published a piece titled, Macau, once the pearl of the Orient, today it's a city without purpose. The journalist noted that in Macau, romance is dead. Even drug trafficking has lost its mystique and allure. Drugs are still easily available, but even they are no longer the same, as one erudite addict lamented. In the olden days, there was something gentle and refined about drug addiction. We paid attention to such things as the 5 essentials for enjoying opium: a dark room, a bright lamp, a pipe that sings, a rain on the window, and a loquacious friend. But today, most people have switched over to heroin because it's cheaper and easier to conceal, and it just isn't the same anymore. Now they just take heroin with their cigarettes and go around chasing the dragon or inhaling heroin fumes. The United States government antagonized Portugal's plans to develop tourism. In May of 1967, the Consulate General of the US in Hong Kong issued a letter to all American citizens in Macau to leave immediately. The letter said, in view of present conditions, we believe Macau is not a safe residence for Americans, and your continued residence there would be at your own risk. I therefore urge you and your immediate family to discontinue residence there as soon as possible. International news outlets picked up the report, and the warning reappeared in newspapers published in German, Spanish, English, all spreading the message that Macau was unsafe for US citizens. A few days later, Portuguese diplomat Benito Garcia expressed to the Portuguese embassy in Washington the government of Macau's discontent over the US embassy's warning to US citizens to leave Macau. He said, there is clear intention to harm Macau. At the same time, these warnings reveal that America is decisively supporting the British attitude to Hong Kong, where the situation remains tense with capital flight and reduced tourists. And so I'll just start wrapping up because I have a lot more, but cultural diplomacy has been and continues to be an important aspect in historical and literary studies of Luso-Hispanic Asia. As a political tactic, it opens possibilities to consider the myriad ways that cultural forms emerged from Iberian-Asian encounters. Diplomatic correspondences, news reports, and other forms of cultural production about Macau provide ways to examine the political work of affect and aesthetics in negotiating claims to sovereignty. And so today, I'll just end with this. This is a really, I was there just a few years ago. And so now the PRC has made Portuguese an official language in China. And, you know, the tourism to Macau is really popular among people from mainland China. And the Chinese government asserts that it's so multicultural that even, you know, this place is part of China. So you should just see how it flips again. Thank you.
Invite our guest speakers to the table now so we can have a discussion with all of you. So I want to open the room for, oh, yeah, does it works? Yes. I want to open the room for discussion as soon as possible, but maybe I can start with a question. No, at first I want to thank you for sharing your magnificent work. No, your book project, no, your first books, no, but also your future projects. That was I'm very grateful now to be here with you. So I maybe want to start with something that Paula was saying at some point of the presentation, no, what you were talking about, Craig Santos Perez, no, that maybe we needed to let go that global scale. No. And I was thinking about the title of the event, no? Decolonizing Global Geographies, no? And I was thinking, can we do that? No? Or maybe we have to let go the idea of the global in order to decolonize, no? So I don't know. My first question is related to that, no? Of course, this kind of work, it's in a way possible in an institutional framework, thanks to categories as the global Hispanophone, etc., or Luso Hispanophone. But how do you feel about them now, no? And maybe because a real thing I want to ask you, no, is about mapping, no, as a critical practice, that it's common to all of you, no, not only to all your books and presentations, no, but also to your teaching, no, and your practice as educators, no. So and I think when I talk about mapping, what you do, it's always something that is smaller in scale or larger or outside or beyond the global, no. So, and it's also something that is not really about spatiality only, but about temporality as well. And of course, the idea of the global prescribed a very specific spatiality and temporality. So maybe my first question, so you can start talking about your to the audience about your trajectories, it's how do you why it seems to be so important, this practice for doing this kind of work, and how this practice has evolved or changed, since you started, and I'm gonna leave it there.
So primeramente quería decir que Craig Santos Perez and I come out of the same cohort of Berkeley Ethnic Studies. So we went to grad school together, yeah. So, and he came out with Hacha, I think in our second year of graduate school. And I remember him telling us, this is going to be part of a series of 12 books of poetry. And we were all taking some minutes, and we were like, ay, Craig, por favor. Like, but we're not to drink to celebrate it. But it's really incredible to see the work taken up so many years later even, right? And to take it in such good faith and such excitement. But I'm thinking about the question about the global, in the global Hispanophone, the global in the kind of global geographies and all of that. And I'm thinking back to the workshop that we had earlier today, and I'm thinking about the question of the locus of enunciation, of the place from which we are writing and thinking the work as important. And I think, Paula, when I'm thinking about the Caribbean, I'm thinking about Craig's work in Guam from a Chamorro worldview. I'm thinking about the work coming out of the Caribbean or even Equatorial Guinea or any other place from a particular perspective. Thinking about the world from that place is different than thinking about the world from what Craig Santos Perez this is the baby brain working right now. When there's a specialist of American Studies where he is talking about the kind of perspective from the empire and the way that they imagine the world to be, and they want to map the world and dictate the globe through that point of view, that perspective, and then for all of us to accept it, rather than us kind of being able to think for ourselves from these small places, quote unquote small places, about what the world could look like in multiple worldviews, right? Like to think about like a kind of pluriversal perspective of the globe, rather than us having to swallow the map, the current map of the world as it has been offered. And I think that then thinking about these places, these quote unquote little known or oftentimes invisibilized or ignored places as a place to then begin to think about the world is quite exciting. And I think it also offers us some subversive modalities to think through rather than the kind of imperial terrapelago. That's what they called it. It came very late. There you go. imperial terrapelago rather than that perspective. So, I mean, that's where I would think about. I think about that locus of enunciation where we're speaking from, especially when we're thinking about mapping, and mapping not only as cartography, but mapping a structure, a feeling, mapping, as we were talking about before, food, mapping, in terms of like people's movements and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful for me to think about Ricardo Padron's work, who has talked a lot about the functional work of borders and maps. He's an early modernist, and so when we're talking about the Pacific, different times, the borders change. So even when, it's not the same thing, and they're fraught, and so they're really functional ways to think about it. When is it this versus that, and what does that do? And so I think that it's just for me as historically like-minded. I'm not really a historian, but I like to think. I like to think with history a lot. But it's really helpful for me to just situate this, a cartography in a specific time, and then to think about things like affect or food or aesthetics kind of as coming out of a culture of that time too, and nothing's really kind of, and even in that time, if it's constructed as this way of knowing the past, to even question how these things are constructed in that space as well. So for me, I always find it really exciting to trace cartographies of ideas and also ideologies of how things come together in a place, how they adapt, take shape, and then move, and what that really does functionally, how people respond to that or reject it too. I think is really interesting, but really to kind of not think in binary ways. I really like to think about really rhizomatic formations of things. So for me, maps, I don't really think in maps, or maybe my maps are just like very wild, like roots of a tree. You just don't follow my maps because you're not going to end up anywhere. But so I don't know if I even answered the question, but
do you ever find yourself drawing maps when you're teaching? Do you ever? I've always found myself drawing maps, like really like all of those
Conceptual maps.
Yeah. I'm like, and then this is the Pacific, and this is the airline thing, and they're like, those are just shapes. Like that's not a map. Like,
But you have taught a course on mapping, no?
I did, and we actually did GIS, and we did like serious. We really did mapping. We were in the computers and doing things in them, and
Yeah, you went to the digital mapping.
Yeah, things happened. We made actual maps. But what was fun about the class is that we took these humanities ideas and we tried to put them into GIS, and we found how quickly they got very tied down to things like fixed racial categories when we're trying to do something against that. So the GIS platform itself demands this rigidity, like reaffirmation of racial hierarchies, all these things. And so we just ended up making maps and realizing we shouldn't really make maps. Or these are maps that we don't like. It became a lot of things like that.
So for me, like when I wrote that like as an afterthought, like, oh, we should actually let go of that. I was thinking how, the global becomes tricky when we think it alongside like this idea of like the practice of comparing, because like as I'm thinking of my next project, it just seems like, okay, this is such a small island that I'm looking at, like what could be the impact of it, and sort of I feel myself caught thinking in those terms. And so I think this is where the global has to be redefined, that it has to be, it has started a lot with the sort of transperipheral connections, which has been quite productive, but I think we should let go of as well the idea of the periphery, right? I think we are at that moment where we are letting that go as well. But I guess I could talk as well about when I first saw that map of like Las Indias Occidentales. I thought, oh, that's exciting that the Pacific is at the center of the world. But then when you really read through it, you kind of realize that it's just kind of replicating a different sort of imperial gesture. And even, for instance, I also thought it was exciting when, for instance, Mexico thought of itself as being at the center, and I think it's as well. This idea of as Ana Paulina was saying, the borders are shifting, but the centers are also shifting. But the fact that these ideas of global are as well. So there's like this a legacy of it. So Mexicans as well, kind of thinking, okay, actually the Pacific belongs to us. The galleon trade belongs to us. So it was just interesting to see how many imperial powers are kind of fighting to claim that galleon trade.
Maybe. Do you want to say something, Yomaira?
Interesting about, because like one of the things I wrote on periphery, because I also think about the periphery. And so I'm thinking about world systems theory and the kind of ways that then thinking critically through something like that then allows us to see how much the kind of centers are actually really dependent on the periphery, but also to think about it both from a kind of philosophical perspective, to be on the periphery, to be on the outside of some of the most horrendous acts of history, but also to suffer through them. It also gives you a different perspective, a point of view, subjective position, you know. And I often think about, like, what does it mean to be someone? Picture this: you're in middle school. There's a fight. Okay, there's a fight. It's happening in the middle. It's all in the middle, right? You're like standing around, and who is gonna be able to tell you a little bit, to give you a good sense of what's happening? Is it someone who's like standing in the middle? Is it the person who's fighting? Or is it the person who's standing up and able to see all the things that are going on, right? From a particular kind of peripheral perspective. And I often think about that because I think being peripheralized, it's a really shitty position to be in, right? But I'm also thinking about what are the advantages of being in the periphery and being able to observe the kinds of moves that are being made in and across empires, in both big kind of large global scale, but also in this kind of smaller space. And then to think from that place is quite transformative. So I don't know. I am thinking about your complication of the periphery, and I'm thankful for that because I'll be sitting with that all night. Okay, thanks.
And I think, yeah.
I also think it's really important to think about, you know, subaltern spaces as a space where people are really fighting for, you know, basic human rights. And so it is important to think about that in a way the periphery and the center, they're interdependent, they're codependent. So, and a lot of the things that happen is erasure of that codependency. So I think it's really important to think about that codependency and how certain, you know, behaviors, desires really continue to allow for the periphery subaltern lives, you know, precarity to demands that kind of situation.
Right, in the kind of forms of extraction, right? Like the demand for extraction of like labor, resources, and lives happen from that place, and yet oftentimes they're dismissed as unimportant precisely because they're on the periphery, right? So then to kind of privilege those positions, as we're also trying to shift those forms. But I think one of the things that I'm cautious about is that we're not trying to like do away with peripheralization in order to recenter a different person, but actually trying to fundamentally transform the kinds of inequality that are baked into colonial modernity, right?
Yeah, and when you think about the flows of economies and capitalism that happen in these peripheries, it's a really interesting way of thinking about also a really brutal capitalism. And, you know, we don't even think about certain forms of how that works. You know, if you think about, usually we think about capitalism, you know, it's circulation of luxury goods, money, everything. But then in certain spaces, there's also this really brutal kind of capitalism, which is about circulation of arms, drugs, people, and, you know, that's also part of that economy. And then there's this really, it's also a really savage way of understanding the economy that's tied to the, you know, the more like, if you think about the desire for luxury goods, and then if we open up the space instead of fragmenting that desire to the trafficking of, you know, people for labor, it's all completely connected. So it's also thinking about capitalism in these very, very broad senses, and how it's you know, people living in different aspects of the economy are also part of, you know, these systems, but in really different ways.
No, for sure. And I think I would say that that one of the important aspects, and I think you kind of brought this up when you're thinking about Portugal and the slave trade, right? Like, is that we're living the afterlives of enslavement, and that is also kind of the living legacy of the kinds of permanent war, right? To use the kind of word with Nelson Mandela Torres, to think about the kind of normalization of these forms of war in everyday life, whether it is on the kind of larger global or imperial or national scale, or the kinds of human trafficking that you're talking about. But I think hand in hand with that is also the kind of ongoing forms of colonization that are oftentimes kind of erased and not seen. So we think about Puerto Rico as part of that as well.
And actually, I had one of my next maybe comment, or one of the comments that I thought when I was listening to your presentations is precisely related to that, no? Because Ana Paulina, you were talking about something that was very interesting to me that I didn't know about Macau, is precisely what we are saying about this ambiguous geopolitical and territorial status, no? That it was, you said that it was and they really wanted to leave this ambiguity in place, no? And that's an experience that's very familiar, of course, to Puerto Rico, no? But also to Guam, no? And this aesthetics of the unincorporated, no? And I was thinking about that, about the colonial legacies of colonial exceptionality, of creating these legal territorial frameworks, no? That create this of course, these uneven situations. But maybe my question was related to the whole debate that we are having now. If it is possible, I'm thinking about also what Yomaira was saying about the witness, but also about maybe Apocalypso as well, no? It is possible that these experiences and these points of view allow us to rethink sovereignty, you know, and sovereign acts and freedom from different places or not, or it's so I think it's a very, very interesting question when you study the history and the experiences of these small places, no? So maybe, yeah, to kind of continue the conversation, I think that's what we are kind of discussing, no? If it's this perspective could be, can we this idea of the last person was this Black girl, no? And how that experience it's allow us in a way to kind of see a futurity that maybe is not that clear in other positionalities or something like that, no? So that was my question.
Your question makes me think of how the alternatives that are sort of created in these sort of discourses that kind of keep on changing, and in your presentation, Ana Paulina, when you were talking about how all of a sudden we embrace this as having this Portuguese legacy because it's part of this multiculturalism is now our new discourse. I was thinking about how, in the case of the Philippines, for instance, they come up with this new form that they will say, okay, we're going to give you your independence in 10 years, right? And so it kind of blurries when they finally become independent. I mean, in between, there's a huge war, but how they kind of create this confusion by making the Philippines free on the 4th of July, right? So they kind of make this, I mean, then they kind of change that, of course. But they kind of create this pathways where they make it difficult to think about sovereignty. And just in the case, for instance, of Rapa Nui, even though I didn't talk about it, there is this constant discussion of, well, could Rapa Nui survive if it wasn't part of Chile, right? And so, well, this is something that they should decide, and not this pressure to be the defining point of whether we should or not think for pathways to sovereignty. So, yeah, that's a great question.
I would say, building on Ana Paula, your comment about the binaries, I think that's precisely like when I'm thinking about the case of, for example, Puerto Rico being the oldest colony in the world, right? Like continual colonization since 1493. One of the things that we think about is the question of sovereignty and what can that look like. And oftentimes we have the sovereignty presented as a binary, right? Like you can be sovereign if you decide that you want to be free, right? Like, and that's that, and you will be poor and miserable, and we'll make sure that the IMF crushes you, right? We're just gonna pulverize you, or you can be kind of free, and it's a free associated state, right? Like, and that there is this sense that we have accepted a series of like definitions of terms as fact in our moment. They're quite new, right? Like things like sovereignty and confederacy and all these other kinds of these formations are quite modern. And that I think that precisely thinking from a place like Puerto Rico is a really exciting place to think about what sovereignty can look like in our contemporary moment outside of these two options, right? To stay as semi-free, supposedly, second-class citizens, or to be quote-unquote free, but under the kind of crushing neocolonialism of global banks, right? And so it's exciting to potentially think about that. But at the other end of it, we have the actual toll of austerity and suffering and lack of water and electricity and ecological disaster and all of these other things at the same time that it is like a ripe and exciting place to think about new possibilities for living liberation, right? in our time. So it is also fraught.
Yeah, I think it's also fascinating to think about these spaces because they're at the same time cracks, but also an extension of political power from these other places. So it's fascinating to think about what how a place so small can mean so much for different places. I mean, look at Taiwan, right? I'm not even going to tell Taiwan, China, right? Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, Macau, Shenzhen. I just say them all together always because, it's just so fraught. So, I mean, what that means for the space, what it means at a certain time, and who controls the narrative of it. I think these spaces are fascinating for thinking about all of these things about sovereignty, about political boundaries, borderlands. And of course, they're a very new phenomenon. They come about with the creation of the nation state, but they have their longer colonial histories too, of course. And so, these ongoing kind of post-colonial histories.
I want to open the discussion to the audience. Please, questions, because we have like 10 minutes, so we want to make the most of it.
It's not really a question as much as just like an observation or a thought of mine, but Yomaira, you mentioned like the limit of like the white imagination about things with like colonialism or like these types of like systematic racism, and I consider it's like a lot of like people in those groups like they view it's like the opposite of, or it's like those like compensations to like these like minorities or like concessions as something like a zero-sum game. It's like you're like it's almost like projecting that like the existing like historical bases in these like racism, when in fact, let's say for instance indigenous like communities just want like the restoration and like the either guaranteed like protection, for instance, of like just their lands, instead of like actually like taking away like the rights of like white people, like, and that it's just like something that I was like thinking about.
Yeah, that's one way to kind of think about it, right? And I think indigenous people have always talked about like land back. It's not like we're going to exile you all, and like right, but it is about particular kinds of like rights to places, right? But I think when thinking about that, when Michelle Cliff is talking about the limits of the white imagination, she talks about being a white passing Jamaican woman in the presence of white people, and how they would feel really comfortable talking really badly about Black people in front of her, and then when she reveals herself to be Jamaican and Black, they're like, they're like, she's like, it is that moment where I don't fit neatly into the box that they thought, right? And all of a sudden I'm one of them, when the other appears to be a white person. Apocalypso, it's the end of their worldview, and the end of all things, because she's in the flesh a proof of foundational violence, of colonialism, of rape, of genocide, right? And all of these things. And they've also just revealed themselves, their true selves to her, right? What they actually think about the other. And I think what's exciting, and I love that you are kind of taking that and going with it in a different direction, because whenever I teach that essay, I kind of put that sentence up and I have my students think about the question of like, when the other appears to be the one apocalypse, so what are the kinds of scenarios in which that could happen? What happens when you frighten that white imagination, both from with your presence, but also with what we're studying, what we're thinking, and how we're approaching the material, thinking through established foundational myths about places and time, right? That is kind of challenging and scary to some people.
Thank you. I have a specific question about the Manila Galleon, but I think it can involve everyone. Is that, in my experience, that is not too much, but I think the Manila Galleon is really interesting, but the nature of the archives surrounding the Manila Galleon, it's really about the commodities and the objects and a really economical point of view. So I was wondering, what other archives can we, or maybe approach the same objects but from a different point of view? Because sometimes what I feel that is missing is sort of like the human nature of what was going on in the Manila Galleon. And yeah, I just wanted to ask all of you for some ideas of how to approach those archives and those objects.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, right? I think that I remember one panel that I presented on some time ago, which was called the Spanish Trans-Pacific. I remembered an art historian who was trying to challenge us to think beyond archives, and one of the ideas that came up because of Bernal actually is to look at language actually as an archive, and the way he does it, because he has a book that's kind of like could be like a prologue to El Gran Océano, but he writes a book called Mexico and Filipinas, where he gives like a list of all these words from Nahuatl that are used in the Philippines. And in Craig Santos Perez's Hacha, for instance, he also kind of traces the use of, not just the use of the word, but also achiote being so important, having all these uses, medicinal uses in Guam. So I think language is kind of like it can function as an archive. And also to think there's just maybe, I don't know what archives she consulted, but Paulina Machuca, she's a historian that looked at how in Mexico there's the production of a coconut wine, and that actually tua having come from the Philippines. So she kind of looks at a cultural practice instead of as you say, like this luxuries. And I've not looked at the archives. I'm not an early modernist, and I don't know what I would do with them. Yeah. But with language, I can get some ideas at least. And it's I think when I hear a early modernist talking about the Marina Galleon, está repleto de mexicanismos, ¿no? De Nahuatl.
So I have a question, if I can ask one myself. When we were thinking about the dialogue of the scholarship together, one of the things that, we were thinking about is also how do we take this work that is challenging different kind of axes, linguistic, geographic, cultural, and how do we push those into what I think are still conventional disciplinary frames, right? If we look at the job searches this year, if we look at the way that we fill departments, it still feels that there's so much resistance to the kind of challenging scholarship and the innovation that you all are speaking towards that pushes against that. So I'm just wondering if you can also think about kind of where do we go, how do we let the research that is being described that is so important to working against those disciplinary boundaries, and yet it feels that the resistance to that is still quite strong in our academic frameworks. And of course, the four of you are professors within an institutional context. So where are the other spaces then of kind of cultural or knowledge production? And I know from your work, a lot of you have been doing work with community organizations or other kind of voices. I'm just wondering, where are those other spaces then, and how do you dialogue with those as another kind of force to question or put into light the way that the places that we sit institutionally are still quite resistant to those disciplinary, the cross-disciplinary or counter-disciplinary moves that you're making in your own research?
So this is a separate thing I've been doing. I've been working with the Teheru in Rio de Janeiro called Ile Omolu Oshun. And so what we've been doing is doing a series of podcasts to reconstruct the history of a woman named Iya Marcolina, who was initiated into candomblé in what's today called Nigeria. And then she was kidnapped, taken into trafficked to Bahia. And as a young girl, she was 11. And then from there, she continued to practice candomblé. She continued to speak Yoruba. And she was part of the Great Migration to Rio de Janeiro. And she was part of the key figures to bring samba and candomblé to Rio de Janeiro. And so when I've been working with them, one of the things that they really resist are academic ways of talking about anything they do. And so they're like, we don't want to do that. We have our own way of telling our history. We're very clear that we are the protagonists of the story. And so this is something that I've encountered across other places too. I was recently in a conference with Algerian scholars, and they said, somebody said, oh, why don't you think about, decolonial? And then they said, Indian scholars, and they said, well, decolonial is a really nice academic exercise, but it's really impractical for us living in this place. And then the Algerian scholar said, yeah, reparations, we tried all of that. We tried independence wars. We tried all of that. Look at us, we're still where we are. And so I think one of the ways would be to have dialogues with people who are working in these spaces, bring them to campus, do the hybrid thing. And it just challenges us in such rich ways. Because after they said that, we thought, okay, that's true. Like, why are we not in dialogue more? We were talking about, I was doing this conference called Global Racisms, and we brought scholars from South Africa and Ethiopia to talk about what race means, where they are. And it was very rich. It was very rich, and it's not something we really talk about outside the US. So I think just opening up, avenues to do that would be a start.
I would say that with the theme of dialogue, at least within academia, with Philippine studies in Spanish in particular, I think that one thing that at some point, I think in conversation with other colleagues who are working on it, like Matinitao, I'm just going to name it so that it's on record, but and also other scholars, we kind of noticed that many of the people that have been studying this literature have been primarily peninsulary sometimes. Same happens with Equatorial Guinea, even though, of course, we have Yomaira. But I think like there's some of that traditional sort of binary of like Iberian studies versus Latin American studies that that has shifted a lot, and I think that's great. And thinking about like maybe dialogues across again, still within the walls of academia, but I have found it very fruitful to talk to my colleagues in American studies and Pacific Island studies. And so last year, for instance, we tried to, and we did do a Pacific Island Studies Film Festival. Unfortunately, it wasn't very well attended by the students, but I think there's so much more that can be done beyond the classroom setting, at least, right? I mean, it was really fruitful to talk to the directors of this Guam documentary that was done, and similarly, my colleague who is a specialist in Guam, she found it as fruitful as well to talk with this Rapa Nui director, right? So I think there's as well a lot that can go on through one's institution, and the idea, I mean, is to open it up beyond the walls of academia.
For sure. I think I have a few points, but one of them is like I want to dig my heels very deeply into anti-disciplinary work. I think often of Africana philosopher Lewis Gordon's piece of Disciplinary Decadence, when we imagine that our discipline is the one that can actually answer the questions in only the way we can think of. And I also think about the kind of movement and sharing of resources, right? Whatever we have access to, not all of us have equal access to resources at our institutions, but partnering with communities, with artists, with activists, with organizers is something that I've been doing through my entire I feel like I haven't been a professor that long, like 8 years or so, but through my entire career with working and creating like a Women of Color Initiatives project on the campus, or a mentoring program like Muse, mentoring underrepresented students in English, trying to support students that come from HBCUs and HSIs and places like the University of Puerto Rico, etc., to kind of support them into going into graduate work, but also doing things like Palabras, Proyecto Palabras PR, bringing students to Puerto Rico to learn from organizers on the ground, to learn and think through like the actual ways that folks are working in interrelational ways, in spite of and in the shadows of the government, their neglect, right? And then now with the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, the Mellon grant that I'm working on with multiple labs that are working on oral histories, curation, storytelling, and kind of not just kind of creating and processing like archival documents and oral histories that have been forgotten, but creating new knowledge and helping people in different kinds of communities be able to keep and preserve their own archival stories. But I think on another personal level, I think a lot of us, depending on how we come to the academy, I come to the academy as like a first generation high school graduate, like let alone college, et cetera, et cetera. So no one is impressed with what I do in my actual family life, and nobody cares. And so the kinds of conversations that I have to have with folks, or that I have, is my sister, for example, is a fire captain in Hoboken. She's the first Latina firefighter, the whole thing, right? But she'll call me from the firehouse, and we call it the firehouse lecture. She'll FaceTime me from the firehouse, and the firefighters will be like, Yomaira, I have a question. And they'll call me and they'll ask me about feminism, or they'll ask me about the history of Puerto Rico, or they'll ask me, she'll call me sometimes, and they'll be like, how did the university come to exist? Like, we don't understand university. And I'm like, okay, there's this ancient history of university, but then there's a guy named Kant, right? Like, and so they'll call me and they'll be like, oh, there's a new firefighter this week. Can you tell us about the guy who never left his hometown, but he created all the universities, And I'm like, oh, Kant, yeah, the guy who never left his hometown. Okay, yes. And he talked about, right? And so there's the other way, like the kind of community way, the kind of interpersonal way with the firehouse lectures, and other ways, right? Like working with some of the high school kids, and these other kind of methods of like making the work move that I think are even more enriching and more exciting than only having your work circulate in like closed academic environments, right? Like this is enriching and it's beautiful and it's really exciting. But then, sometimes you're like, is anyone reading what I'm writing? Am I writing all alone? Yeah. But then to know that like the random things that you might have picked up in some place are useful to someone else as they're doing that. And I just, not to go on and on, but like I think like I have cousins who'll be like, I'm having this internet fight. Yomaira, what do I say in response to so and so, right? And so I'm like, or, helping someone dictate a text message or like an Instagram rebuttal to some kind of argument. And I think that's when I'm like, they appreciate me now, right? Like this is the moment. But I think that is kind of the way that we make the work move in multiple places, both like through our resources and institutions, but then to remember that like our knowledge is useful in other ways, and vice versa. Folks' knowledge is useful for us.
Well, thank you. Yes. We have a reception now, and we can continue the conversation there. So thank you, and let's see each other outside.